Welcome to the Focal Point Podcast. I'm your host, Tony Riggs. Here I take a deep dive into my personal interests of the hidden craftsmanship, philosophies, and passions behind society's talent. If you're intrigued by artistic nuance, please subscribe and follow on my YouTube channel, Spotify, and Buzzsprout. With that being said, let me introduce you to today's guests. All right, Josh, we are live. We are recording. I thank you for coming on the podcast. How are you?
Thanks for inviting me, man. I'm excited to chat.
Yeah, no, this is just a trick. We're not going to go through your work. I'm just going to harass you for an hour straight. That's what we're doing.
All good, man. All good.
All right, I
I'm
won't get
ready
personal
for
though.
it.
I
Bring
won't
on the
get personal.
questions.
No low blows. Just go ahead and introduce yourself and what you do and how you got into it to the audience.
Cool. So my name is Josh Andrus. I am a composer and musician. I have been a professional composer and musician for, about 15 years now. Making money off my music. I started in the electronic world, releasing electronic records for a while. And then eventually that led me on a path to get into composition for media, specifically film and video games. And then some TV stuff. I've done some sync licensing and stuff like that, but mostly film and video games. And that's kind of what I've been doing for the last couple of years. It's a very cutthroat business. It's very competitive, but it's something that I thoroughly enjoy. I love making music, and I consider myself, fortunate to be able to make a living doing what I like to do. So
How long did it take to actually start seeing income being produced from what you did?
It took a while. So I started when I started making music when I was 19, actually. So I had been in like bands and stuff in high school, and I like rock band. I remember I was in like a punk band. I played guitar, and I actually been playing guitar since I was 6 years old. I'd been playing music for quite some time. I honestly didn't know which sounds crazy. I grew up in a really small town, which we were talking about just before the podcast started. That didn't really have like a music scene per se, right? It's just was really small. And other than my high school experience, like I didn't know like what a composer or a producer, or like I didn't understand how music was even made, really. I just thought like, bands went into a studio and they recorded. I didn't understand there was all these other people, you know what I mean? Like engineers and producers and all this other stuff, So I didn't really get into music until I left, and I moved to a larger city and was introduced to some hip hop artists actually that told me what music production was, making beats and stuff like that. I literally had no idea. And it's kind of how that was my intro into it. And I started doing that when I was like 19. I didn't really start seeing any money until I actually moved from hip hop to dance music. I started making EDM right around the EDM dance music genre really started to grow, like right around 2011.
That's right, when it started
music
becoming popular again. I remember that. Yeah.
Yes, like dubstep, trap, those like subgenres of dance music become super popular. And since I was a hip hop guy, I actually met another producer in Chicago, who I was there actually for work training, because I had a job working at AT&T for a while, and they had a corporate office there. And I just got promoted, and I had to go to Chicago for like a month to train. And I was going to some of the clubs there, with some of the other people I was training, and I was the first time I was exposed to dance music was in Chicago. There's this club called Evil Olive, and they had this crazy party, man. It was called Porn and Chicken, and they literally would show pornography on a screen and serve fried chicken. It was bizarre, but it was freaking packed, and like Diplo would show up to that party.
I can only
Skrillex showed
imagine
up one
why.
time. Yeah, it was wild. And the music actually was really, it was good. It was really cutting edge, for the time. Like I said, trap and dubstep are growing, and I had been making hip hop anyways, so it was like very similar to trap. The nice thing about it to me was like, wait, I can put out instrumental records and I don't have to rely on like artists, because it's difficult for a producer to make a living, especially when you talk about splits and stuff like that. And you have to chase people down for money and make sure you're getting paid for beats and all this other kind of stuff. So it was, I was like, wait, I can just like put these out. I am the artist. I don't have to get somebody to do, vocals or anything like that on it. And I started, releasing records that way. And that's when I actually started to make money. And I would say it started to kind of pick up a little bit, and I ended up moving I quit my job when I started to pick up from AT&T, and I moved to New York in 2013. And yeah, that's when I actually started to kind of see like significant income. I started to get featured on blogs and different things like that. 2015 was probably a huge year for me, or my biggest year or one of the biggest years of my career, at least as far as just as an individual artist and producer. I had a couple of dance records chart on Billboard, millions of streams. I was touring. We did 32 shows that summer. I played EDC, played some really big shows all over the country. And, that's when I really started to see kind of that, the income. But like around the time, like 2015, 2016 is also when the bubble started to pop. You know what I mean? It started to deflate a little bit. And dance music was getting really saturated. There's a lot of people doing it. And it was much harder, and this is kind of around the time too, I would say, like a lot of the news outlets and how people consumed, Instagram was getting, its traction at that time. And I think that, it was as far as like as a media outlet, and a lot of the things like the blogs and stuff like that I was used to, like shopping music to blogs to get featured, to have my music marketed, they just weren't the same. And so things were changing, like within the industry. And so it started to be more about like, how can I get my music in social media videos like reels and all that kind of stuff, that was starting to become popular, and it just was different. So it was around the time that I had actually had a partner that I was doing dance music with. He was an incredible artist. And he basically just told me one day, he's like, dude, I just don't want to do this anymore. It's not a good lifestyle. I have to, I have a family, because he just had a kid, and he was like, I can't do it anymore. And that was kind of like, lights on for me as far as, okay, maybe this is time that I change. Maybe this is time that I make my exit. And that's kind of when I started to study composition for film and media, and seeing if it was a viable career path for me. Cause at this point, I already been doing music for a while, and I had a lot of connections within the industry, that I meant doing dance music. So, but, completely opposite of what, I was doing. Like I said, I played in band. Like I played the trumpet, played some, I played guitar. I could read music, but up to this point, I had never written sheet music. I didn't, I could read it, but I had never sat down with the, pen and paper or anything and write it down.
Yeah.
And there was, at the time, there was software that could do a lot of it like there is now, but it's nowhere near what it's like now, so it became, an interesting step in a direction, because basically I lost a lot of the popularity that I had built, to do this pivot, because it was a complete career change. And so, that was kind of a drop down in revenue. But over the last couple of years, I've been able to build that back up again, and I'm now in a pretty comfortable spot, so.
Where did you meet the connections when you were more involved in the music scene for film and media?
Well, so I had decided to, basically around the time I started to take, watch YouTube videos. I read a lot of books. I looked online. I, started to kind of get things. And my goal was to try to get into a course. Like I wanted to see if I could go back to school. I had never actually finished my bachelor's degree. I never needed to, because I started making money off music, and I just decided that I didn't need to go that route. And I had some credits, but it was something that I never, I just didn't need to finish it. So I was like, okay, maybe I'll go back to school. Maybe this is like, because it's definitely more the traditional route. You know what I mean? Like scoring to picture is pretty difficult, actually. It's one thing to like see a picture and be inspired by it and write something for it, which a lot of artists can do, that make music. But cutting to the picture is the difficult part, changing time signatures, speeding up and slowing down tempos, making sure things fit within the frame of what the director's trying to do. that's the kind of stuff that I really didn't know anything about. So what I did is I studied for a while, and then to answer your question, I actually applied for a certificate program at the Juilliard School, and like I said, I was living in New York at the time. I didn't really think it was possible that I would get in, because they only accepted 6% of applicants that got into the program.
Oh goodness.
And I wasn't, this was a graduate certificate program. So for me, a bachelor's degree wasn't required because of the certificate program, but it was preferred. So I was like, I'm probably not going to get in. But I'm like, you know what? I'm going to do it anyways. So I studied really hard. I had to write a bunch of scores, this was really like my first time writing scores and that kind of thing, to like, like actually writing pieces to sheet music. And I did all that. I submitted to the school. I had like 4 interviews, and I actually got in. And I couldn't believe it when it happened. And I remember thinking to myself, like, okay, now that I'm in, I can't really be a poser now. I really got to try to figure this out, So I studied even more. But through that program, I met a lot of people, and started to kind of reach out, because I now had the Juilliard name attached to me. I was reaching out to people, you know what I mean? I was reaching out to uh, say, hey, I'm a film composer. This is where I studied at. This is where I got my certificate at, blah, blah, blah. And that was kind of how I really built up. And I was applying early on to like pretty much anybody who would let me score. I was just doing it for free.
Mm.
I was like, okay, you know, I'm in a position. And by the way, I guess I should also take a step back to explain that in addition to when I stopped doing the electronic music stuff, and I was saying I made the pivot, one thing that I wanted to do, because I knew that eventually making acoustic music or using live instruments, not electronic stuff, but any kind of acoustic music, I started making sample packs. And I was lucky to be teaching at a school in New York at the time called Scratch DJ Academy, and I was teaching music production there. I was teaching Ableton, and there was a company that was just starting that's pretty well known now. It's called Tracklib, and Tracklib had come into the school to explain that they were starting this sample clearance service, and they were basically talking to kids, or well, not kids, I should say, students. Excuse me. There were a lot of adults and kids, a lot of students about sampling. You know what I mean, and clearing samples, the importance of clearing samples. Scratch DJ Academy. I was working with hip hop artists, house DJs, all this kind of stuff, and all these people, but primarily sample based musicians. Right there, they may use some synthesizers and stuff like in that in Ableton, but it's primarily sample based. And they were trying to market themselves as like an alternative to Splice. So I had long story short, basically met with them, had a really good conversation, said, hey, I'm doing these sounds now. A lot of stuff I'm doing is acoustic. I'm really trying to get into, being a composer, not just a producer. I really want to compose and work with live artists and all that kind of stuff. They gave me a shot to do some work on their site, which ended up doing very well. So fast forward now,
Okay.
it's kind of a side caveat, or side
Side
step from
quest.
what we were just talking about. Yeah, side quest. But I was generating money through samples, so I was able to support myself, off the samples that I was selling, and I was still teaching part time. And so basically, I was basically like, look, anybody who will give me a job that I can build a portfolio to show what I'm capable of doing, that's what I'm going to do. I will say that I think, and this is kind of maybe a hot take, but I do feel like it is. A lot of people think that they should get paid for their first job. Not that I'm against that. If you can work it out, totally go for it. I think
For
that's
sure.
awesome if you can do it. But you should also keep an open mind, especially if it's for a job that may be like in your wheelhouse genre wise, right? So like let's say for example, you're really good at making like hip hop, right? Or making electronic music, and a director comes along and says, "Hey, like I'm doing the score. I want it to be all like rap in trap music, right, or whatever." Those are kind of rare, right? So in those situations, you may say, "Okay, I probably should take this if I can get the opportunity because it's something that I'm comfortable in. It's something that I know I can do quick, and it's something that I can do efficiently and really showcase my skill." Because the biggest thing that I run into is that people want to see they want to see your portfolio. They want to see what have you done, right? And honestly, what I've come to notice, and it's kind of shifting right now within the industry, is that the portfolio itself, like they don't want to see rescores. Like if you're rescoring scenes for certain movies and stuff like that, I've had super bad luck with that stuff. I would highly advise against it.
I saw that you
And
did
I
some
think
of that stuff, and I scrolled through it. I'm like, oh, this is pretty good.
I did early on. Yes, I had really bad luck with that, and I wouldn't recommend it. Now, and I'm talking about specific scenes from movies. Now, if you're doing like trailers or like the intro credits or stuff like that, that's a little bit different.
Okay.
I think that usually you can get away with that kind of stuff. But if you're doing specific scenes that from a film, you really have to be careful with that. And I think that a lot of people do that as a way to get in, but the thought process, which I don't agree with, by the way, but the thought process is, well, at least a lot of directors that I talked with, that you're seeing that and you're pulling inspiration from that artist, so you can't pull your own inspiration from that scene, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
So basically they're saying, because you're hearing what this other person did, you're influenced by that, so what if I give you something with no music at all, which by the way, spoiler alert, that doesn't happen. Every director will give you temp music that they put into their film, you know what I mean, where they'll say, because
Guilty.
usually what they're doing is they're editing to that, you know what I mean, they're doing cuts to the particular scene, you know what I mean, so like they're editing to the temp music. So a lot of times as a composer, you'll get a piece of work and the tempo or BPM may already be established for that particular piece, right? Because they've cut it to temp music, so it's like you have kind of a place to start, which is pretty much what rescoring is. But that's been like my experience with that, is that usually that doesn't help. So if you can get your hands on like short films, anything like that early on, highly recommend. So the thing you got to do is go out, meet directors, meet people who are working on projects, find out. I think too, like you got to think to yourself, like, do I want to focus on video games? Do I want to focus on TV? Do I want to focus on film? Obviously, I have an open mind for if things come up, because usually if you go into one, you end up doing the other one that you didn't even think you were going to do. But just really try to focus on what you want to do at that particular time, right? Just to get the credits. And that's how you meet people. The relationships these days are just super important, man. Honestly, I was just telling my wife this the other day, it is so competitive right now. I have never in my years of composing, seen so. I mean, you'll go to try to submit for a movie online right now, and people are getting 500 applications. I did a film called Bagman Rising that's coming out next year, and we finished it. And when I was talking to the director one night, he's like, "Dude, I had 1,000 applications." He's like, "But you were the only." He was, "You know why you got the job? You were the only one that messaged me on Instagram and said your film looks awesome. I want to be a part of it."
It seems so simple, though.
It does. It does. Yeah. And it actually was, and to be honest with you, that's before I knew anything about the job. And this goes back to what I was just saying. I was ready to score it regardless of what the pay. And it ended up being like a really well-paying job, actually, to be honest. He was a Canadian director. His name's Phil. He has a company there, and they got a grant from the Canadian government to shoot this film because his last film did really well. And it looked incredible. They used the red cameras. It was very cinematic. It looked awesome. And the cool thing was he wanted like a John Carpenter style score, with synthesizers. And I was like, oh, that's like a rarity. And that's why I was like super down to do it. Because, as much as I enjoy doing orchestra music, it's nice to kind of step outside your comfort zone and kind of do something that's different, So, that particular situation, he was like, you were really the only one that messaged me that like cared about my vision, And I think that's also part of something that, as a composer that I see, specifically like with a lot of young composers that come up, is it's different than creating music, right? So like when you start to take on a role as a composer, they already have an idea of what they want the sound to be. You shouldn't really try to force down, and by they I mean the director, you shouldn't really try to force that sound down that director's throat. You really have to listen to what they want to do. Because when I was starting out, that's one thing that I struggled with, is I always wanted to get really musical and have all these like really cool things and really show my chops. This is what I'm capable of doing. And a lot of times it's the more minimalistic things that end up making the final cut, just because it's film first. Obviously, it's film, dialogue, sound effects, all that kind of stuff that help tell the story versus the music. In
Do you
that
find
particular
that to be the most
situation.
common theme nowadays with directors is that they want minimalistic music and instead of like more old Hollywood orchestral scores?
Yeah, I do feel like that's the trend. I do feel like it's. I've had many conversations with other composers about this. I really feel like our jobs almost got very sound design esque. Where we're
Yeah,
kind of more or less
kind of the age of Hans
complementing.
Zimmer.
Right. Yeah. I mean, this minimalistic thing. It's very minimal. Um, and I think it's kind of a twofold thing. Personally, I think part of it is that it minimalist doesn't get in the way of the story, right? So I think that's one part of it, which a lot of directors love, obviously. But also, I think another big part of it is budgets. There's not the budget anymore to have a large orchestra.
Hmm.
A lot of things are going direct to streaming. Orchestras are expensive. It could cost $30,000 for a day's worth of work with an orchestra, because essentially you're paying 50, 60 musicians to be there,
Yeah.
and then you got an engineer and you got the recording studio and all this kind of stuff. So, I think what you'll see a lot, and you can, turn on the TV and you can see it, or watch a movie, is if you do have an orchestra score, you may have a full orchestral theme where like it's got this massive orchestra and it's the main theme for the film or whatever. But then, throughout the film for the cueing, where you have the different scenes, it's very scaled down. You might have just strings or just brass, or maybe you have synthesizers in there that are kind of filling that particular space. And I think that's become more common. But I also think, to go back to your point, I do think that you are finding that directors aren't doing these big elaborate scores anymore. More importantly, because I think it's kind of it gets in the way of what they're trying to do. And I also think that certain films, they call for that, but then certain films don't. And I think it's also being able to recognize that. Like as far as like I can tell you, like for this Bagman movie that I finished, um, he was, the music he had sent me, he had actually said to me, the director Phil, he said, I think music in Hollywood sucks right now. He's like, it's terrible. He
Hmm.
was like, he goes, I just think it's very boring. No one remembers it. And I think this is something that needs to come up. And it's good to have a director that understands that. But for those out there that are ever in a situation, sometimes it's also important to explain to the director that the music is a marketing tool. For example, if I go to Universal Studios and I walk in the gates and they're playing Harry Potter, from John Williams, I might think to myself, wow, like I haven't seen that movie in forever, or like, whatever it may be. You know what I mean? Star Wars, for example. These themes they've become synonymous with the movie, and they kind of help sell the movie in a sense, or you maybe make you go back and watch it, which generates revenue. So I think it's also to explain to somebody that, you know, totally understand. I want to make your story the best. I don't want the best it can be. I don't want to get in the way, but let me enhance it. Let me help you. Let me try to be a collaborator here and really show you what we can do. Um, so I think if you get to that stage, then if they still decide not to go that route, usually it's budget. Usually it's budget, and to be honest with you, I think we also have a really big problem where, because of budget, a lot of demo music is being done with MIDI. And I can tell you right now, I've had the luxury of working with multiple orchestras. MIDI does not sound like a real orchestra. There's not even close,
No.
you know? And so I think what happens is when you send a big elaborate piece, which is normally the demo temp track, the temporary demo that you want to show the director, they're hearing something that, even if you spend time, doing the best you can to make it sound as close to an orchestra as possible, it doesn't have that magic of what an actual orchestra is. And I think if you go back to, like you said, in the golden years of Hollywood, where you had these big orchestral scores, there used to be orchestras on call, where essentially, there's stories of composers writing a piece and then walking into another room where they have 40 musicians waiting to play a demo. You know what I
Mm.
mean? To show someone, and this obviously was before what we have now with the MIDI tools. But I think that's part of it. So they're hearing something that doesn't capture that magic that you as a composer might know because you've had the opportunity to work it before. You know what I mean? So they'll be like, I don't hear the difference. I don't really think we should pay for this. Let's try to do this. So that's a situation where I think you as a composer have to kind of do some things sometimes that you may not want to do. So I can tell you, like, for example, I just did a video game called Blind Warrior. It's on Steam right now. And the funny thing about it is the director of the game, it's like a Ghost of Tsushima style game. It's by an Indonesian company. They're doing great work. The director was like, yeah, I think we're good with the demo track. And I said, no, dude. I'm like, trust me. I was like, let me get an orchestra to record this.
You
I
were
was like, I'm
personally
gonna tell
offended
you
by
right now.
that.
Well, it's like because I know the difference. Like I said, like I have been very lucky that I've worked for some incredible musicians, and I told him. So I actually took money out of my money that was paid to do the score to record the theme with the orchestra to show him the potential of what it would be, which actually ended up paying off. And now he wants to do the whole thing with the orchestra, which will be better for my portfolio stuff anyways. You know what I mean? So it's like those situations, I think a lot of time, you really have to think to yourself, it's like, it's like they always say, like you have to read between the lines, right? Like if somebody says no, they may tell you a reason, but there's probably a deeper reason than that, right? And I think that a lot of the time what's happening is the demo that you're trying to show what this full orchestral musical score can do, either A, is too much where it scares the director away, or B, it just doesn't sound as good for him to be like, okay, yeah, let's take an extra 15, 20 grand out of the budget to go record an orchestra score. You know what I mean? Which is a lot. It makes sense. So yeah, I think, yeah, that, to answer your question, it was a long way to answer it, but I think that's kind of where we're at right now as far as music in
Well,
the
I'm hoping that the
industry.
transition, in the coming years, goes back, honestly, to a more orchestral score, because we've seen everything visually. I think at this point, we've seen the peak of what CGI looks like, of what
Hmm.
explosions, of what sci-fi elements could be, and and the novelty now is that emotional undertone that sells you what this story is going to do for you if you go and consume the content, whether it be
Sure.
video games or media, because we've seen everything at this point. And,
Yeah.
when we go to pay for something, we're going to pay for something that's novel, or
Right.
at least that feels subjectively novel to us.
Right. And I think it's a great point. And I think that, it also comes down to consumer. It's unfortunate, but if, for example, if the score is done and a movie's successful, the package itself is looked at as, okay, this was successful and we got away with it because we only spent 100K for the composer and the entire score and his team and all that kind of stuff with the synthesizer score, where it would have cost us 250 to do the orchestra because we had to fly to London and do it at Abbey Road and all this kind of stuff, right?
Mm-hmm.
So their thought process is, well, if it, which from a business perspective, I kind of understand. They're like, okay, we don't really need to do that because it didn't make that big of a difference. Because I do think, like you kind of alluded to this a little bit, the John Williams, the Jerry, Goldsmith, these people that Ennio Morricone that made incredible orchestral scores, we don't really have that person, right, that can do that. Because, for example, like a Hans Zimmer, right, which, I mean, Hans is obviously incredible. We all know that. He's a legend.
Mm-hmm.
But even his music, he's openly talked about how a lot of times he's layering things with MIDI and working with a smaller orchestra. So I think it's one of those things where the industry itself doesn't want to adapt or spend the extra money to those things to make it sound better to the composer, because the average consumer doesn't care as much about it. Maybe they do, maybe they don't, but if they do, it's not as voiced as much. You know what I mean? People don't talk about it as much, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
So I agree with you, man. I really do hope that it changes, and I think I do think though, one thing that I do think is we've already had John Williams. We don't need him again. You know what I mean?
Well, I don't know
Um,
about that. I
eh,
quite enjoy John Williams.
no, and I understand that. What I'm saying is that you can get John Williams music by listening to John Williams. There needs to be somebody else that is
Mm,
comes along now that does something new, does something fresh, right? And can pull inspiration from John Williams,
for
right?
sure.
But it needs the reason that I mean, you know, Steven Spielberg talks about this about John specifically, where he thought when he brought John on that orchestra music in Hollywood was already starting to die. You know what I mean? And he brought him on to do these projects with him. And John really influenced a whole generation of composers, yeah, multi generations of composers to come and start making orchestral music for film again, you know? And so I think we're kind of in the same position here where we need somebody to do something that is going to be unique, right? And for Hollywood to say, okay, this is something fresh, this is something new. We should spend the money on this. You know what I mean? In the same situation. Like I said, not to downplay John because he's a legend. He's one of my favorite composers ever. He inspires me. You know what I mean? I even got to work for his family for a while. Side note, when I moved to LA.
Oh, really?
But yeah,
That's cool.
which was cool. He had a philanthropy project for education, which was really cool. Um, but it's I do think we need to figure out what that new person is. Is it a form of hybrid? Is it synthesizers mixed with orchestral music? Is it just orchestral music by itself? Is it jazz? Maybe the next thing is like a jazz artist that does something crazy that's great. I think it's just as listeners and as people who love movies and love music for media, we just have to figure out what that next person's going to be. And I think that it's kind of like it's for example, I'll tell you just a quick side note. Danny Elfman, one of my favorite composers. Love Danny Elfman, right? I mean, everything he's done, like even the stuff he just recently did for Wednesday, great stuff, right? Danny Elfman has a particular style of what he sounds like. And I watched a film the other day that uh, it sounded very Elfman-esque to me, and it did not match the movie at all. Oh, I was just even my wife, who doesn't even really pay attention to that stuff, said the music didn't match. You know,
Well, like
highest to the
like
lowest.
two different styles of stories were just colliding.
Yeah, it's like exactly correct. Like the music was kind of portraying one style like of like feeling, but it really didn't match what was happening on the screen. In our opinion, I would say the same thing could be said about like the recent Spike Lee movie Highest to the Lowest. There were some like very like big swelling orchestra pieces in there that stand alone they would be beautiful. I'm not discounting the work. The work is great. I
Mm.
just don't think it matches that particular film. And granted, that's my opinion. Like somebody's opinion may be different. Obviously, it got past somebody who in the editing phase or the producer. But I also think that's like something that we have to consider. You know, when are those scores right? Like when should they be used, right? And I don't think that we're in a place where they shouldn't be used at all. But I think that because it's hard now to be able to get those scores, how are we using it? So if somebody comes through and says we have a budget to do a 60 or 70 piece orchestra, how, as a composer, it's your responsibility to figure out how can I use this in a way that will still match the story. You know what I mean? It's not
Mm-hmm.
just don't just do it to do it. You know what I mean? Like I think that's part of the thing, and I think sometimes people try to, to copy their idols, and which is fine. A lot of great artists have learned and built on other things that other artists have done in the past. Is how we are where we are. But it's like I think you have to try to say, okay, how can I make this unique? How can I do something new and exciting that hasn't been done before? That's going to inspire a whole new generation. That's what I think is important.
Which do you think is actually contributing more to the competitive nature of today's current marketplace? Do you think there's too many artists or there's just not enough work?
Uh, oh, that's a tough one.
Because it could be, a
I,
combination thereof, but there's going to be
yeah,
one or
yeah,
the other more so.
sure. I I think there's plenty of work. I
Really?
think there's plenty of work. I do. There's a lot of work out there. Now, when I say work, is it enough for somebody to sustain a livelihood? Because a lot of these jobs are peaks and
Right.
valleys. You may go months without a job and then score get a job where you make 30, $40,000 off of a film. That after 6 or 7 months of zero work. You know what I mean, of trying. I think the biggest thing that one of the toughest things right now, in my opinion, is how easy AI has made it to apply for
Mm-hmm.
things, right? And so I feel like the biggest thing is you can go on and submit, for a job, whether it's advertised on like a discussion board, or like on there's a site called Twine that has stuff out there that you can do. LinkedIn sometimes posts composer opportunities, that kind of thing, and it's literally they just get slammed, like 1,000 people, and it's just because now people can do it from their phone, and they can click and they can do it right away. And actually, it's actually funny. I was having this conversation with another composer this morning, actually, where I said, I also think we're in a time where everybody tries to be a jack of all trades. And a lot of that is because of the current state of being a composer, right? You're trying to get any gig you can because you're trying to make a living, you're trying to get
Mm-hmm.
paid, you know? So I think what happens is a lot of people apply for jobs that maybe they aren't qualified for. And what I mean by that, and all due respect to all the composers out there, is that, for example, if you've never written a jazz record in your life and somebody calls for a jazz score, why are you applying for that score? You see what I'm saying? Because chances are you're probably going to get passed on anyways. Not necessarily a bad thing, but I'm just saying you're basically, for somebody who might only listen to so many applications, right? They may not get to somebody who could be the next, John Williams or whatever it may be, right? Because of that particular situation. So I think it just also, this is also, I am a firm believer in something that I preach, that I feel like you should really try to become a specialist in a particular style, right? So like, for me, one thing that I've really focused on is, usually I like to write very dark music, and I find myself that I get hired a lot to do like sci-fi and horror stuff. That's like my thing, right? And I think it's just of who I am, Um, and so, like, knowing that going into those opportunities, for example, somebody, and I've passed on many of them. If I see something that's like, oh, we need a composer for a kids show, right? I may
The
pass on
next
that
Barney.
opportunity. Yeah, right. Because I just don't think it's great. Now, somebody out there can write great music for that and probably make a fuck ton of money, to be honest with you, between you and I. But they're not. They're it's not me, right? And so I try not to apply for those particular roles. I try not to be involved in that kind of thing, because I hope that maybe one less person might give somebody else an opportunity. I do think about that. It is important. So I think that's also part of the reason right now that you're seeing it's very difficult to get a job as a composer, is it's because it's saturated, not in the sense of there's not enough jobs, because there are enough jobs. It has to do with qualifications, right? Like, do you feel you're qualified to do that? Because at the same time too, there's a lot of people who don't, and I hate saying this, but I'll kind of explain it, but don't have the training to do it, right? So like they make beats or whatever, and they'll say, you know what, I want to get into making film music, and they'll start tinkering around with some things on their own, and they can make a decent demo, and they'll apply for those jobs, but they've never actually cut the picture, right? So they don't, like I was telling you, they don't know about time signature changes, or automation to speed up and slow down tempo and all that kind of stuff, and the deadlines that you have to meet sometimes are crazy. You might have a day or two to redo 10 minutes of music, which is crazy. So I think it's sometimes they don't realize that. So I think you're also fighting against people like that who maybe shouldn't be applying for that particular job at that particular point. Not that I don't think they should go for it, in a sense of, maybe that instead of, like, if you're a beginner composer, try working with another composer, try collaborating with another composer on that particular job, right? Say, hey, I just saw this job go up. I would love for us to work on this together. Let's submit a joint demo, right? Because, to be honest with you, like Bagman, for example, Bagman was like almost 80 minutes of music that I did for that film, and it got to a point. It
2
got
hour
to a
movie?
point where it's called Bagman Rising. It's coming out next year. I did 80 minutes of music. It's for that film. It's like a thriller horror film.
Okay.
It was crazy, and I could have used. And to be honest with you, I did at points. He pushed it back for a year. That's why I decided not to do it. But if I would have had my original 6 month deadline, I would have 100% got somebody to help me with that project, because it was just too much. I mean, it's just too much music. So it's. I think you really have to kind of think to yourself too, like, in those positions, or when you're applying for those roles, am I putting myself in the best position for my career as well? Because you don't want to do something and then not deliver, because that's bad reputation. you know?
Right.
So I think that's also part of it. I think there's a lot of hobbyists out there who are trying to make it a career, which I fully support that 100%. I hope that somebody can do what they love. I hope everybody can do their passion. I really do support that. But I would say if you're just starting, searching for opportunities to work with another composer, I think is the best way to do it. And it would also alleviate a lot of the stress on the system right now, to be honest.
Are there any things that aren't composing related or music related that you think are putting external stress on the industry that's causing a bit of a backlog?
Budgets, 100% streaming right now, especially, for example, you can, like Apple, Apple TV is $10 a month, and they put, multi-million-dollar films on there, and I think if I remember correctly, they only have like 20 million subscribers or something like that. It's like a really small number compared to Netflix, which is wild. So they're actually losing money on, on their service. Amazon, same exact thing. And it gets crazy too, because we're also in a sense fighting against royalty-free stuff. I'll give you a perfect example. This literally just happened to me. I had a lunch meeting with somebody who worked at Audible, the book app.
I love that app.
And
It gets me
yeah,
going
it's
through the
cool.
day.
Yeah, that's awesome, man. So one thing that they're starting to do is they're starting to do like audio dramas, which I think are awesome, by the way, because I'm a huge Bernard Herrmann fan, and it reminds me of like the old school like radio dramas, And so they're starting to do audio dramas,
Like War of the
and
Worlds.
yeah, exactly, yeah, right. So he was like, he's a creative director there, and he was like, I'm a big fan of your music. I really like what you do. He was like, it'd be great if maybe we could. He wanted to collab on some stuff because he does sound design. He also does like he basically is the audio director, and he was like, so I have this idea for this book that we're thinking about turning into an audio drama. He was like, check it out, tell me what you think. So I listened to the first chapter. I said, oh, this is going to be great. He said, okay, I got a meeting this week. He's like, I'll bring it up in the meeting about doing an original score. Well, he told me that they decided that they want to just use loops, royalty free stuff.
No.
So I think that's also part of it. Yeah.
Oh, man.
Why not? Because if you think about it, right? So if you think about it, if you're somebody who's trying to save money for your business, right? Why would you not use something if you could find something good enough that fits in there that you don't have to pay? Because for example, for an audiobook, usually, or like with a big company like Amazon or doing a film for Apple TV, you can charge anywhere from $500 to $1,000 per minute of music. It can get very, very expensive very quick, right? So if there's a library service out there that can essentially deliver royalty-free stuff, right? Or pre-cleared music for film and TV, which is also a big thing, for smaller fees, you can use that in that particular situation, right? So it's not even just like these companies don't have enough money for it, because of course they do, and I think that's what everybody says, which is they're right. But it's also because why would they? You know what I mean? For example, right? So if you have enough money, like let's say you have enough money to, buy let's say like a video game, right? So let's say you have enough money to buy a video game. Like I tell you, like I'm a big gamer. I played Battlefield 6. Battlefield 6 just came out. $100 for the premium service, $70 for the regular one. Of course, the $100 is going to give me a little bit more, but I'm like, yeah, you know what? I really don't need that. I'll just do the one for $70. So they lost $30 from me, right? That's kind of the situation I'm in. Could I afford it? Yeah, of course I can, but I'm not going to because I don't need it. You know what I mean? And that's kind of the situation. This goes back to what I was saying about the scores now, with a lot of them sounding the same, and we need like the next John Williams. What I'm saying is, what are composers doing to like really make themselves sound like they need to be part of this, right? Why do I need to be part of this? What can I do to enhance your story, right? And so, I had a conversation with this creative director. He's awesome. He's a great guy. And we're going to continue working together, and something pops up down the line, great, but no harm, no foul. I've been there before. I understand, it's all good. But I'm just saying those are the type of things that we're up against, and like say AI is only making that worse. I personally know composers now who have worked on some big video games, I can tell you, uh, that use AI to shop demos and have gotten jobs because of that.
Wow.
Where they'll say, okay, generate me 10 cues, and they'll push a button, and so instead of, because a lot of times what will happen, for the listeners that may not know, is usually when you apply for a job, you know, through whatever, they'll narrow it down to like 10 people, and they'll say, okay, here's a scene. We want you to score this scene, and we're going to pick the best one to do the film, right? That's
That's your
usually how it
audition.
works. Right. Just kind of, it's like an audition, right? So, but that takes time. You know what I mean? So, for example, I may take a day or two doing this 2-minute scene, because obviously I want to sound the best that it can. I got to mix and I got to master it, and I got to
And
do
it
all this
takes a
other
lot of
stuff.
skill to be able to do
It,
that
it
in a day
oh,
or two.
totally,
A lot of time and
100%.
years that goes into it just being able to
Sometimes
do
it's
that.
more for more people, right? You're right. Totally, you're totally right. And so what happens is you know when you're trying to get a lot of jobs, if you're like, let's say you apply and you have 3 auditions, right? So now you have to prioritize, because basically usually the auditions, man, like, I did one recently. It was 2 days. They gave people 2 days to score a minute and a half scene that they sent it back. And honestly, they're trying to weed out people. That's literally what they're trying to do, and which makes sense, because they may
Right.
say it may be 30 people auditioning for the job. So it's like, well, if we can get rid of half, it'll be 15, right? Um, and so you're up against that, because now some composer may go to like Udio, for example, which is an online AI service, and generate for example, they'll say, because usually with a score, sometimes it does, sometimes it doesn't, but usually the director will send a temp track, and you can see who it is. It may say James Horner or whoever it may be, right? John Williams, whatever. And so you can say to Udio, generate me a minute and 30-second clip in this particular style, right? And it'll generate 10 tracks that look like that, and you can do 10 different things. And then if you're, for example, somebody who has a really good background in like sampling, can go through and Ableton and make it line up. You know what I mean? And there's your demo, right? And it may take them an hour or two to do that, versus somebody working on something for 2 days, right? So then they can hit all those deadlines at the same time for all those different auditions that they got, right? And I see it. I see why, and I know these people that do it. They're very talented individuals. It's not that they couldn't compose it. It's just that they're trying to save themselves time, because they basically are like, a day or two that I put into this, if I don't get the job, I just wasted a day or two, doing whatever. Because, for example, if this is how usually is with auditions too. Usually with an audition, you're creating music to a particular scene, which means that you're cueing it to a particular scene and cutting it to a particular scene. So it's not going to fit a different scene later on. Sure, you may be able to retrofit it for something else that comes in. You know what I mean? But for the most part, it has specific cut points for like things that are happening on the screen or whatever it may be. So you may not be able to reuse that. So it's like, that takes extra time. So it's just like, I think a lot of the guys now that are doing it, we're up against that. We're up against that as well. Not only are we up against the budgets, not only are we up against the competitive nature, but we also have the AI, people being able to submit demos super fast. And if you think about it, if I'm a director and I get 500 applications, I mean, just think of the fatigue associated with that, especially if the first 10
it's
or
awful.
15 applications. Yeah, I mean, you think about the first 10, 15 applications you go through are not even close to what you're looking for. And sometimes the directors bring it on themselves, of course, because they don't really say what, the style or whatever it is. They'll just say, oh, I'm doing a horror film and we want an orchestral score. It doesn't say like in the style of, Jerry Goldsmith or whoever. It just basically says this, horror score, orchestral horror score, which can mean anything, And so I think a lot of times they do it to themselves, but like, that's kind of what they're up against. So it gets to a point where you may only listen to the first 100 applications. And that's happened to me quite a bit. It's happened to me quite a bit where I've sent in an application, and then usually what I'll do for my demo, I actually have, so for my portfolio, I use SoundCloud links. A, because one, anybody can listen to it, right? But B, more importantly, I can track it and I can see who's listening and I can see where they're listening. And
Okay, I didn't know that.
Many, many, many times where no one listened to my demo, and they'll pick somebody, and I applied for a staff composer job, another one back in like June of this year. and I noticed that they didn't listen to my demo. So one day I was on LinkedIn and I actually found the hiring manager for the job. It was for this game called Poppy's Playtime, which is a pretty big horror game. And I had messaged him, and he was really nice. And he was like, "I'm gonna be honest with you, man." He was like, "We got like 3,000 applications for this job." He's like,
Oh,
we
wow.
couldn't listen to them all." He's like, he goes,
Hmm.
"I'm gonna guess we probably didn't even listen to yours." And I was like, "No, I could tell you, I could tell you didn't." I told him because I could track it, and he was like, "Yeah." He goes, it just was overwhelming." And he was like, "We ended up actually going with a staff composer that we'd worked with in the past, who offered him a full time position." So it's just like I think those are some of the things that we're dealing with right now. It's not that the jobs aren't there. It's just that also, for example, you know, let's say you have a there's another thing to think about. Let's say you have a gig you're working on for a movie, but you know in a month it's going to be up. You're going to start applying for other gigs, even though you're already on a film. You see what I'm
Yeah.
saying? To try to tie it over, right? So it's not even like a lot of times you're applying, like everybody's jobless looking for a job. A lot of times you're fighting with people who are producers, like I said, who may be like, yeah, maybe I'll get into film composition. That's one. The other one, you're applying with somebody who maybe is like, in college, still learning or studying the craft, which again, not necessarily a bad thing, totally for both those people to do it. But I think that they should partner together first, and try because they'll help each
Mhm.
other out. Or the third thing is you're dealing with people who are jumping from job to job, right? So they're already looking for like the next gig, which is smart. That's what we should do. But I'm saying, so you have all these people essentially applying. Doesn't mean that everybody's, like I said, doesn't mean everybody's looking for a job at the same time. It just means that's the situation that we're in, and it just gets overwhelming.
Mhm.
You know?
Before I pivot into your personal craft and the craft of actually composing, there's one more question that I want to ask you. What do you
Yeah.
think is the end? What do you think is going to be the end result of all this? Because it seems like the industry is there hasn't been a point like in the last 5 to 10 years where it's settled on a model and then people have adapted to it and then we can kind of have an understanding of like what we need to do in order to actually make money on our art. And now AI is thrown into the bunch.
Yeah.
And now we don't know
Yeah.
where it's going to go.
Right.
And a lot of artists are very talented,
Oh yeah.
more than enough talent to go
Sure.
around.
Yes.
And now we're having to fight with we're not just having to fight with ourselves for jobs. Now the companies are having to fight just to be able to float. Like a
Right.
lot of the major companies now,
Sure.
they're being hyper competitive with each other just to be able to make ends meet at the level that they do. Like I don't
Sure.
like a lot of these companies are not doing that great, and they're having to continually. The investment that's gone into the industry right now is astronomical because they're trying to overcompete, and so now they're trying to save on these other projects, and it's just not. There's a bubble somewhere. I can't put a name to it, but it's a big bubble and it's going to burst. And I'm thinking, what's going to be the end result once it pops? You know?
So yeah, I actually I have a take on this actually. So I think it's interesting. I think you touched on a lot of things right now. I think one thing people don't realize is that, well, maybe you do, but it's like you realize it, but it's in the back of your mind. YouTube is the number one source of content for people. I
Yep.
mean, YouTube is massive, and I think that I personally have gotten gigs off films that went straight to YouTube that I did. They didn't even get distributed. You know what I mean? And they did great. You know what I mean? So those happen, and I think that's also going to be something that we'll see. I think we're going to see a growth in YouTube because it's free and everybody has access to YouTube. I think that you're seeing short series. I've seen a couple things around LA pop up where there's a lot of companies that are starting that are doing short form content, which are we talked about the audio dramas for Audible, but kind of like a short form video where there's like a mini series that is on Instagram or TikTok or
Vertical
something like
media.
that. Yeah, exactly. And short, you know what I mean? It's like a 3 minute episode or whatever it may be, or sometimes even shorter than that. And composers are getting
It's the
hired for
modern
that
day
too.
soap opera. That's what it is.
Yeah. Oh, totally. 100%, dude. And I think that, for example, those are the things, like going back to the Audible thing. I thought the thing was so cool. And, the guy who I spoke with, he was at first like, I know it's just an Audible thing. I'm like, no, dude, this is sick. I'm like, I'm totally down. I'm like, this sounds awesome to me because I feel like that kind of stuff, those kind of so a Audible thing was cool to me because people listen to it all the time and they're like in the car and they're away from a TV and not from a screen. And sometimes it's good just to be away from a screen and listen to something. And so I knew that was also a big potential new media outlet. But I think that's what's going to be. I think media is going to change. And I think we're seeing that right now. I think we're seeing that people, as things get more expensive, like groceries and rent and all those kind of things, people are turning to free content that they can get. And we always think of like, content creators, right? I think that's like a common thing is like, oh, it's only content creators that are making content for YouTube, like
Unfortunately, hold
video
on, not
game.
to interrupt you. It still has a derogatory term,
It
content
does.
creator, and
100%.
I
You're
don't.
no, you're
I
right.
don't. Yeah, I don't
You're
know
right.
why that is. It's kind of like we're
You're
still
right.
stuck in like the 2012,
I know.
like
I know. You're right.
parkour, YouTube
Yeah.
video thing, and it's just
Yeah.
like
Yeah.
it's not that now.
No, it's different. Exactly. And the production value of a lot of these things have gotten, great, and like I said, there's some incredible filmmakers who are putting up awesome films. For example, I watched an anime, an alien
Love
anime
anime.
that a fan, me too, and that a fan made and he put it on YouTube, and it was great, man. It was like really well done. I can't remember the name of it, I would tell you, but it was Alien. It was Alien, like it was inspired by the Alien series, and had millions of views. And I was just curious, and I put in, I did the calculations to see like about how much money this guy made, and it was estimated he probably made around 70-80K off this series based on how many
Purely
views he
AdSense,
had,
I'm assuming,
right?
right?
Yeah, ads and stuff like that. Yeah, or premium subscribers or whatever it may be. And so a lot of these people are also monetizing their channel through Patreon and these other things like that. And so there's budgets out there. And I think sometimes, you know, composers kind of overlook that because it's not the glamorous like TV and film gig that they're looking for. You know what I mean? They want to go straight to streaming. But those will pay. There's people out there that'll pay for those types of things. There's people out there will pay for custom music for their mini series or their short film or whatever it may be that goes straight to YouTube. And I think those are opportunities, especially if you're like somebody who's getting into it. Those are situations that you shouldn't pass up. Those are situations that you really should take advantage of and try to think of how you can be somebody in a new medium. And then on top of that, you can become a content creator yourself, right? You can become somebody who is posting whatever, you know what I mean? Like I've done some things where I played around with some of the AI video generation things and just practice scoring, like I told you, because I got such flack about doing rescores. I started doing AI generated videos and just scoring them for practice. And I tell people if they're AI generated videos, I'm not trying to be a movie director, but the score themselves are real. And I think it's interesting because usually when they generate those videos, you're not really controlling what it does. So it's kind of like you're getting it like a director would, you know what I mean? So you have to still cut it and you have to do all these things that is just really good practice, to try to get into it. And those are things you can post, to try to build that content. And then also too, from a composer perspective, I think a lot of composers tend to shy away from, doing things like sample packs or all these types of things that are out there that have been extremely lucrative for me that I think that's where the industry is going to go. And I think to answer your question, to be somebody who's making music these days is not to be just one thing. You have to do everything. You're going to touch every little thing, anything that you can do to try to generate revenue, whether it's make sample packs, do YouTube channels, do, short films for up and coming directors, do some speaking events, teach, those types of things. I think that's also part of the gig now. It's not like you could just focus on, and honestly, it's kind of always been like that, really. I just think it's just now it's easier to find different ways you just have to be open-minded about it.
Yeah, well, Spotify and Apple Music and those platforms, they democratize the music industry. The music industry doesn't really exist like it used to back in the 2000s.
No, not at all. Yeah.
And YouTube democratized television. We
Yeah.
don't really have TV shows anymore. We have YouTube series, and now we have streaming.
And I can tell you, kids, for example, I've taught, like I said, I worked for the John Williams family for a while, and we did education at a bunch of different schools around LA. YouTube is how kids watch stuff now, man. So like the future these kids that are in high school, by the way, when they graduate and they start, their life as an adult, which is not that far down the road, 5, 6, 7 years, right? What the content they know. YouTube is only going to grow because they are getting full produced TV shows now that are on these channels. You know what I mean? So I think it's just you really have to be open minded to those things.
The only thing that's keeping, I think, the movie industry, the old movie industry model alive right now is the fact that theaters are still producing enough income for it to be worthwhile to keep that model alive. But
Sure.
it's not producing the type of income unless you're doing like a big blockbuster, which is why we only have big movies now, and they kind of
Yep.
feel the way it is now.
Sure.
We're not seeing the type of films that, like, I don't think Godfather would get greenlit now.
Yeah. It's crazy to think about, right?
All of
Yeah.
those great movies, or like Sixth Sense, those types of
Yeah.
movies aren't getting made now because they're not profitable at the box office.
Right.
And the theater industry right now is the only thing I think keeping barely the old model alive. But it's still a bubble now because we have streaming, and we're getting like the new Stranger Things series is like 6 movies, 6 really
Right. I
long
saw
movies
that. Yeah. Sure.
packed into one thing you can
Season.
get for $20 a
Yeah.
month. It's
Right.
nuts. And so the margin just isn't there, but there's just enough to keep it alive. And I don't want to say like the theater industry needs to die in order for everything to happen, because nobody wants the theater industry to die. That's,
Sure.
the communal aspect of going to see a movie and then having this like unconscious collective experience as you're all watching the big screen it makes, I don't know what it does psychologically, but it makes a movie what a movie is supposed to feel like.
Sure.
And
Yeah. I agree. Just
I don't
experience the sound.
I don't want it to die, but I don't want the situation that like the industry is in right now. So it's like,
Sure.
what's going to happen, And
Yeah. I mean, I think that it's just one of those things where like you said, it's interesting right now specifically because the films that are being made, and you touched on this, they're like the remakes or the guaranteed, like the Marvel stuff, you know what I mean, like the guaranteed hits, you know what I mean, for those particular things. And in an artistic style film, um it may not get greenlit, or it may go straight to streaming, like you were saying. So some of those things, like, yeah, I think about, like Tarantino's one of my favorite directors ever, man. And I think about like how many of those films he did may not even get greenlit if he was just starting out. Like Pulp Fiction
Right.
never made it to the theater, you know what I mean, in the modern age. So I think that, that's something to really think about there. And we're starting to see it a little bit. I mean, Tron, people are saying that Tron's not doing very well right now, and that's a big blockbuster film. You know what I mean? So we're starting to see some things where I think that the public's starting to stand up to it. I don't know if it'll change. I don't know what that future holds. Like I agree with you. I hope that it doesn't die, because I think it's an awesome experience and it's something that I enjoy to do, but it is in dire, it's in a rough place right now, I think.
But the
So
hope is that this is not the first time it's happened. Now, it's the
no.
scariest time it's probably happened, but the movie industry, like even back during when Spielberg was making his movies, they were going around. Spielberg got picked out of university because the theater industry was dying. They're like, okay, let's go try to find some new talent. Maybe we'll have that sort of like renaissance come about as a result, ironically, which is usually what happens. Like usually there's a dark
Right.
time, and then suddenly there's this blossom of a flower that happens just out of nowhere, and then suddenly it
Sure.
sparks it. So it's like a lot of cultural changes. They just happen out of the blue, and
Sure.
it just is what it is.
I hope
But
so. Oh.
yeah, but right now it's dark out, and I don't like it.
Right.
But I want to get into your personal craft a little bit, because this is kind of like where I get my personal interest out of. I'm not a composer. I think it's fascinating, but like I alluded to earlier in the podcast, is that I love those orchestral scores, because if I can listen to like something like a long, like 20-minute piece by like Wagner, and I close my eyes, I can see the movie. I don't even need
Sure.
the visuals.
Sure.
It's like the only
Yeah.
time you can actually hear the book, literally.
I agree.
And
I love that.
it's
really
and
good
it's
analogy.
amazing. Now Hans
Yeah.
Zimmer's great. He has his time, but he showed probably the most you can do with extracting music out of pure sound, out of random sound.
Yeah,
And
yeah, yeah.
that in and of itself is beautiful. It's art, but now we're in the age of like where people are just replicating it, and now it's
Yep.
getting, we're having fatigue from it. But we'll still
Right.
go see Hans Zimmer because he's arguably the goat. John Williams is my personal favorite, but
Sure.
Hans Zimmer, like you can't bash him. But
Right, 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 right.
when you're in the middle of like composing your track, how do you get yourself into the flow state, and then how do you try to keep yourself there as long as possible?
So usually, it depends, honestly. It depends on what I'm writing for. So if I'm writing for like a film, usually I like to read the script. I usually will ask the director for the script because sometimes there's things that knows the director will write in the script for certain things that may not be on the screen, obviously, certain mannerisms of the actor or something like that they want them to cover that it kind of unveils clues about that particular character. Obviously I watched the film closely and I take notes. Usually that's kind of like the first process. I'll listen to the temp music. And then when it comes to actually the writing process, I guess I really focus on the emotional. I mean, this sounds pretty cliche, it's pretty standard, but the emotional, what's happening on the scene. Usually I start with the piano, and I just kind of fiddle around, play a couple keys, try to get a key signature that I like to work with the notes I'm going to use, um, and kind of narrow it down that way. Uh, Sometimes, so that's usually like if I'm like, let's say that I'm just trying to come up with an idea. When it comes to like cutting to the scene, one of the things I actually like to do first, and I'll actually go through and spot the scene, is what I call it, where I'm basically looking for cuts. So I'm saying, okay, there's something should happen right here, and I'll mark it in my DAW. You know what I mean? And something should happen right here, and I'll mark it with my DAW. And then, depending on the sonic palette that the director wants to use, I think to myself, okay, I'm going to use synthesizers here. I'm going to use an orchestra here. And to be honest with you, if it calls for pure orchestral score, I'm actually old school. I like to write music, and I think it's a visual thing to me. I use an iPad. I have this guy right here, and I literally write my music with my Apple Pencil. Write the scores, and I have a program that I can actually import the video into, and I'll write that way. And sometimes I'm just going off of pure visuals of what's happening on the screen and just understanding. The relationship between the notes and the theory that I've learned over time to like try to capture certain things, certain relationships that make things sound darker and brighter and happier and sad and all this kind of stuff, and really capture that. So a lot of times it's just really just kind of locking in, man. I don't really know if I know it's not kind of a very romantic or cool answer, but it's really just kind of locking into like that particular moment and just trying to like have it speak through the music. I am I'm not somebody that really likes to just kind of I will fiddle around the keys, but once I actually have like a key signature that I like, or maybe like a motif, could be something that I play that I feel like really represents the feeling of that. That's kind of where that stops, and then that's when I start really the compositional piece, where I'm like, okay, I have this 3, 4, or 5 note piece or part that I like, and now I'm going to build everything around that. That's kind of like the piece of the puzzle that I needed to kind of spark the creative flow of what I'm trying to do. So like with I can give you a really good example. So the Bagman, the film that's coming out next year, the film itself, the protagonist, which is kind of like a vigilante, he basically wears a bag over his head, and he does things to he basically attacks people. It's kind of like it's a horror film, but it's also like funny at the same time, because basically the
Okay.
character itself, basically he attacks people who don't recycle. It's kind of funny, but it has like this underlying thing, there's like an underlying message. But the character himself, when I first saw the character, he drives a Mustang. He wears jeans and a flannel shirt. And so, for some reason, and I don't know if it's my Midwest bringing up or whatever, but it made me think right away. It made me think of the Midwest. It made me think of Detroit. That's what I thought of. You know what I mean? I thought of like Detroit Muscle. I was like, okay. And so I was like, so originally the temp music the director had sent me was actually a dubstep track. I remember saying to the director, I'm like, I think this track is really cool. I'm like, but I have like an idea for like a rock track. And he's like, rock? He's like, I don't know, man. He's like, I don't really think I want to go that route. And so let me just try to do something. So I had a wah pedal, and I put on the guitar and I played this loop. Um, and I had prior to that come up with a three note like a three note thing, and it made me think of like Cops, this theme song from Cops, like you know bad boy, what you gonna do, da, 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 da,
Yeah.
right, that. And because of the goofiness of the film, I felt like we could do something very similar with that. So I basically was like, okay, so I made this like little theme as like Bagman's coming for you, and I played like three notes, and I said, this is kind of the theme I'm going to build this film around. And he's like, oh, okay, I kind of like that. And I'm like, but I'm going to do it with guitar. I'm going to do it with like a really heavy guitar, like real heavy. And so at first he was against it, but then we ended up doing it and he loved it. And so that motif, so basically I took three notes that I played on the piano, that really were just notes in context. I mean, they could have been notes on paper, it didn't matter. And I moved it over to a guitar, and that became the main theme. And I kind of built the whole song around that. And that became the theme of the Bagman. That's his leitmotif. Every time you see him on screen, the guitar is involved. So not only does he have like a melodic piece that's also part of him, but also there's a three note motif that the listener hears throughout the entire film
Mm.
that's specific to this guitar tone that is like multiple pedals together. I think it sounds very unique. And so it's not just a melodic thing, but it's also a textural thing too. And for that particular, to match that particular character in the same film. One thing the director was against is he actually didn't want to use any orchestra music at all. He was like, I'm trying to capture this like the 80s like noir horror film style thing. Like he was really into John Carpenter, that kind of thing. And there's a scene where there is a woman, and something happens to her, right? And so it's a very emotional scene. So I told him, I said, we need strings for this, man. Like we need to write strings. Like strings have an emotional weight to them that'll really help.
Bring in
And
some
he was,
cellos.
again, exactly. Well, cellos, yeah, like you said. Like I always say, I always tell my wife, it makes me laugh. The violin is the only instrument that can cry. That's what I always say, right? So it's like it just has an emotional depth to it that if you understand, if you get a really good player that can, like I said, that can make the instrument cry. It's very beautiful.
The violin has a very
So
feminine sound to it too.
it does. I would agree. Yeah, I would agree to it. Um, and so I again, same situation. I wrote something, a particular motif, and then I um, had a string. We paid for a string ensemble. He was a little bit more open at that time to try some of these ideas that I'd thrown at him, which was great. And he ended up loving it. And we layered it with like a OB6 or the OB6 synthesizer, so it sounds very 80s. It's an Oberheim, it sounds very 80s esque. With the strings over top of it, but the strings brought that emotional depth that we needed. So what I'm trying to say is sometimes, from my perspective, it may not even be the notes. It could also be the timbre or the color palette that I'm choosing to represent that particular character. I always like to think of the instruments are like the clothes they wear, right? So it's like every time that character is on the screen, how am I representing them? Like, what's their style, right? It's like a fashion almost. Like, what can I do that like, and I do it throughout the entire Bagman film. I have like things where the character is not even on screen, but there's like he's involved in a conversation, and I do I inverted some of the melodic pieces, and I used the guitar pedal, right?
Mm.
So it's like it's not the same melody, right? It's not the same melody, but I'm referencing him through the music as part of the background sound, right? So it's like those things. So like for example, if you're a person watching the film, because I mean, for example, like this happens all the time these days. Like we just you're just talking about how music right now is kind of in a weird spot in the industry, but I feel like sometimes you're watching shows these days and you don't even know who the character's talking about. You know what I mean? You're like, which
Right.
person was that? You know what I mean? It's hard to recognize it. So those are some things I think musically that cues that I like to do, where subconsciously, if you hear that, it makes you think of Bagman,
You gotta
right? And so
compensate
it's
for
like,
bad
oh,
writing.
yeah. Well,
Yeah.
no, his writing was good. I want to say it's actually really good. But yes, for what you're saying, like it's almost like it's like an additive, right? It's enhancing the story in a way. So there's no question about who it may be, right? So yeah, I think to answer your question, it's not always about the notes. It's also sometimes about the emotional quality of instruments. I actually enjoy quite a bit uh figuring out which sound palette I'm going to use. I feel like it's like a painter deciding which colors he's going to paint with.
Mm.
Is it going to be synths? Is it going to be violins? Is it going to be orchestra? Is it going to be guitar? And I do love combining instruments that shouldn't be together. Like I love playing rock guitar with
Feel a
like
bit
a
naughty when you do it, don't
string
you?
orchestra. Yeah, it's great. You know what I mean? You do. It does feel like it's kind of out of place. You know what I mean? It's kind of like a no a sense. In that way. And it's like okay, I think that those are the kind of things that make people's ears, kind of perk up and be like, oh, that's different. So
When music is meant to be noticeable in the scene, how do you know not to go too far with its presence?
it's a great question, actually. Really, really good question. So I actually always say that I like to I like to compose with space. And what I mean by that is I think that silence is awkwardness to some people. And as a musician, it can be. Sometimes you might think, oh, this needs a little bit more. But I think in some cases, you should use silence as an ally, right? So, for example, in a tense scene, having the music fade out completely, right? And then having it build back up again. That empty silence helps with the tension actually, right?
Mm.
Because you hear something and it's not there, and you're like, what just happened? You're kind of starting to listen a little bit, like, what's going on, right? So, sometimes you should think about, okay, I have this, what can I do to make this sound interesting without adding more? You know what I mean? And sometimes that may be little changes in, like I said, with the guitar, like I was telling you just a second ago, flipping the melodic notes, on upside down, and so instead of playing these three notes in this order, I flip them backwards. Now they're in reverse order, but it's with the same instrument. You know what I mean? Like to kind of like change it up a little bit. But I think for me specifically is I actually I love space. I love space. I love leaving space for dynamics. I think that's what makes orchestra music. We talked about, you just said, oh, you love orchestra music. That's what made Bernard Herrmann great. Bernard Herrmann specifically was very known for his minimalistic approach because he could do things with space and knew how to maximize an instrument's perspective. He was a master of orchestration. Um, so yeah, I think to answer your question, it would be managing space.
What aspect of music composition do you think doesn't get talked about enough or get enough attention?
I would say,
And I'm coming at this specifically more from like a perhaps a director's angle. That sometimes directors don't always have, they're not necessarily always composers or don't have a lot of music experience, and so they lack the vocabulary to be able to describe the sound that's in their head.
yeah, it's a good. That's I think it's one thing. So trust the composer. If I had to say something, the composer wants the film to succeed just as much as you do, and I think having a collaborative conversation um, where you both work together to deliver the best possible score, there's going to be push and pull, and this goes for composers as well. You shouldn't just try to force, like I told you earlier, try to force something down the director's throat. But at the same time, if you really feel strongly about something, let it be known. And I think directors should listen because I do think, unfortunately, that sometimes music is kind of an afterthought. And
Really?
I think I do. And I've run into situations like that. Like for example, I can tell you, like saying I don't I think MIDI sounds fine for an orchestra versus the real thing, you know, that's an afterthought to me, man, because like it does not. Why would you want to do that to your film? You know what I mean?
Yeah,
And like I said, even like I said, for your theme especially, because your theme is like the main thing that people are going to remember,
for
right?
sure.
And so it's why not just take that to another level? And honestly, there's situation these days where you can get orchestral scores like over in Europe. I did a session this morning actually. I did one this morning at 7 a.m. with the Budapest Orchestra for a video game that I'm working on. We did a 50-piece orchestra. It cost the director $2,000 for us to do a 3-minute song with 50 musicians, and it's to him it was a no-brainer. And so that particular thing, I think, would say, if the composer is telling you something that they feel strongly about, especially if they have years of experience, I would listen. And you know what I mean? It doesn't
Mm.
necessarily mean you have to do what they say, but try to come to a common ground, you know what I mean? So they can, because again, the composer's going to want the film to succeed just as much as you. And I can tell you a situation, I'm not going to mention the film that I did, maybe you can find it, but I had a film that I did, and the director cut the crap out of my score.
Oh
Like
God.
it was not the same. And the score, the movie got nominated for some things, um, for film festivals,
Okay.
but it didn't. The score wasn't nominated. And he was like, "I'm really sorry, man." He's like, "I thought the score was great." He's like, "The score didn't get nominated," and I honestly was like, "It's fine." And I told my wife, I said, "I knew it wasn't going to get nominated. The score wasn't good. It wasn't my score." You know what I mean?
Right.
So it's like it's situations like that where, you know, I don't think you want your composer walking away saying the score wasn't good after it's something they created. You know what I mean? If that makes sense. And so, it just sometimes it's good to listen to what the composer's trying to tell you. Especially if they've been doing it for a long time. And I'm not saying that everything has to make it. Sometimes the composer's going to win some or lose some, but sometimes maybe let them win some a little bit. You know what I mean? So it feels like it's a collaboration more than like, a job of being told what to do.
Right. You want to feel like an artist, not an employee.
Yeah, I mean, and granted, the direct, honestly, too, usually and I think this is also a lesson that for a lot of composers, when you come into the project, for example, when I came into Bagman, they've been working on that film for 5 years. I was a new guy,
Oh
man,
wow.
and I had to be very cautious with what I said. I mean, a lot of it was the pandemic that really took a lot
Well,
out of
yeah,
it,
for sure. Yeah.
but the thing is, they've been working on it for a long time, you know. And so I had to really tread lightly on some of the stuff out of respect, which it should be. You know what I mean? I'm a new guy coming in. I don't want to tell him that these things don't make sense or this is, which realistically it really wasn't anything that he did that I didn't think made sense. And there was just some things that I thought that I could enhance a little bit. You know what I mean? And
Right.
it took building that relationship, for him to trust me to do some things. And it took me doing some things sometimes the long way where maybe I would score the scene twice and I would say, this is what I was thinking, this is what you're thinking. And then he'd come back and be like, actually, I like the parts you did here. Can we combine these two together? And then, that's kind of, again, that's a collaborative process, so sometimes instead of just doing exactly what the director said, I was trying to enhance it. And sometimes I won. Sometimes he was like, no, I really like the temp music I used here more. Let's try to really focus on that.
Mm-hmm.
So.
For you personally, what is it like to experience being possessed by an idea that you can't let go of?
Oof. It's tough because
Quick
when you
point.
really
Could you
have.
mind centering yourself on the camera real quick?
Oh, sorry. Yeah, yeah.
You're a
Um,
wiggler.
yeah, I'm moving. Um, yeah, yeah. I mean, I think it's tough because sometimes we have a burning idea to do something, and then you don't have an opportunity to do that.
Mm.
Like again, we could just talk about what we just said with the directors. You may want to go a different direction, and there was multiple conversations during the Bagman film where I said, I just don't hear it, man. I literally would say that to him. He'd be like, we need to go this route, and I'd be like, honestly, man, you're gonna have to help me here because I just don't hear it.
Mm.
That's what I would say. There were some characters that to me looked like they were doing something different on the screen, than what he had intended. But then when I got to see the full film made sense because he was like sending me scenes. So it's like some of those things, I think were tough to break. And it really, the few times, I would get frustrated and be like, do I really want to be doing this right now? Like, there'd be some things that I would say to myself like that, and I'm glad that I stuck with it. But yeah, I think it can be frustrating. It really, you really have to remember to yourself, this is a collaborative process. This is a collaborative process. This is, keep saying it to yourself because sometimes if you feel too strongly about something, it can really damage the relationship and it'll just make it worse. You know what I mean? And less likely you'll get your way in the long run for other things.
Right. Well, Josh, it's been great talking to you. I appreciate you
You too,
coming
man.
on. You got a lot. There's some stuff I didn't even get to. I was curious about because you've done conducting as well. Like
Yeah, I
I
have,
saw
yes. Yeah.
that and I'm like, oh man, you got video games, you got like, but you got a lot of experience that I could delve into. It would probably take like a 3 or
Thank
4
you.
hour podcast realistically.
Sure. Well, I'll come back on some other time, man. We got another conversation.
Yeah. Do you have any final thoughts you want to leave with the audience?
Yeah, I mean, just that I would say, well, first of all, thank you for having me on. And I would say that, going back to my earlier conversation, I hopefully I don't discourage anybody from going after jobs and trying to get into it, because I think it's an incredibly rewarding industry, and I want everybody to be a part of it. I hope that what I was saying doesn't, make people feel that I'm trying to gatekeep, because I'm definitely not. I'm just saying that, in those situations, remember to just stick with it. Even if you don't get the gig, doesn't mean you're a bad composer, because most of the time, if you don't get the gig, it's because no one even heard your demo in the first place. So, think
More
about it
than
that
likely.
way. Yeah. So,
Well, thanks for coming on. I appreciate it.
yeah. Thanks, man.